Good afternoon. Welcome to Q&A if you're watching from home or you're watching online. Q&A is the time where you get to pepper the preacher with questions and all your viewpoints that you don't agree with. So I'm hoping that we have some today. But if you have any other questions, not just about the sermon, but Christianity or about City Church, now is the time. Any questions, anybody? It's okay. Thank you. Nengi.
Nengi has a question. Anybody else? Okay. And a question.
All right. Thanks.
Okay. So my question is from 2 sermons ago. Pastor Femi cited like separation of families as a bad thing in terms of Japan for economic reasons. So I was going to ask, doesn't this separation, does it also apply to boarding school, for example? Does this mean that Christians should not be considering boarding school since it's essentially a separation of the family?
As for Francis, as his kids are closer to going to boarding school.
So if you don't mind, just say your name and then just go ahead and ask your question.
My name is Dorcas. I want to ask a question. My question goes like, what about if you are born again and you give your life to Christ for a period of time? So as time goes on, you find out that Christianity is not favorable for me. I can't cope. We now went back. Does it mean you are going to heaven or you are going to hell? Where are you going?
Good question. Thank you, Dorcas.
Hello, good morning. So it's concerning the sermon you just preached on the difficult workplace. So, like, categorically, are you saying if you're in a difficult workplace, you should not look for something better? You should stay there and suffer in the difficulty because God is building you? Or are you saying that you should look for somewhere else, but while you are there, you should still give 100%? Because some difficulties, like maybe they can't afford certain things, but the CEO is financing a sugar baby or 3. The economy is hard, yes, but the guy can do it. He's just not doing it. Yeah. So how do we handle those situations?
Thank you.
So I have 2 questions. And the first one is about shame and the church, like shame as a discipline strategy in the church. So I think in 2 Thessalonians, the whole of 2 Thessalonians chapter 6, I can't remember, chapter 3 rather, and especially verses 6 and 14, Apostle Paul talks about withdrawing from people so that they'll be ashamed. And maybe I'm the one who is evaluating it as lying. There are things like people who are busybodies, people who are idle in church, so withdraw from them so that they are ashamed and possibly will change. And then my question then is, so especially for people who grew up in conservative churches, like you don't use extensions on your hair, you're not supposed to wear trousers, and then you begin to do things like that, and people are not talking to you. So I want to find out if that's an application of that scripture, one, and then how, if that's not what it is, then how should we rightly apply withdrawing from people so that they are shamed, especially because there are other ways to discipline, or how about disciplining people in love? And because I personally don't believe that you can shame people into changing, but then it's just my belief. And then this is the Bible that is the infallible word of God, so how do we hold that in tandem? Then the second question is actually suffering. It's about suffering injustice. So I feel like the better part of First Peter talks a lot about how we should suffer for a while. God is going to glorify us later on. And specifically in 1 Peter 2:21, Peter talks about how we've been called to suffering, especially suffering unjustly. Something like if you're suffering for something that you did, then there's no glory in that. But if you're suffering unjustly, then it's a good thing. Mm-hmm. So my question is, I see you can read when you read Exodus, basically read Old Testament, you see that God is really big on justice, but it feels like he mostly talks about justice from the sense of defending the helpless, the widows. So my question is, does it mean, well, that's not exactly my question, but then does it mean that we should not fight for justice for ourselves? Does it mean that we should just suffer injustice when we are the ones going through it and hope that other people will pick up the cause? I kind of like feel like the answer to the question is no, but I don't know how to arrive at that conclusion if this scripture is supposed to hold true.
Thank you, Nengi. Good questions. Again for Francis. Who else? I think we had one more question.
I think we have 5 questions. But any other questions?
Yeah, we do have 5 questions, actually. We do have 5 questions. Okay. Sorry, it's maxed out. Thanks, sorry. If there's still time, maybe we'll take you. Tomowa, okay, let's have a question.
I don't know if this. Good morning, everybody.
Hi,
My
good
name is
morning.
Grace. So my question is, I don't know how to place it, but it has to do with the workplace. So we have 2 categories of people at work. There are people who are genuine and sincere, and they do the hard work, and then at the end of the day, they give results. And there are this other group of people who are like showy, and try to show themselves. So as a Christian, you're not meant to be boastful. Yeah, you can do the good work, you can do it, and then you have results. And you don't have to be boastful about it. But sometimes being conservative, the other people who are showy tend to like outshine you, and they tend to get all the credit, but you're like, I did this work. How come this person is being rewarded for my work? So I want to ask, as a Christian, how do you balance that? So much so that you have to be audible and expressive about your skills and what you can do, at the same time not seeming like you're boastful at the workplace. I don't know if you get what I mean. Yeah, that's my question.
Good. So I'll take all the questions related to work, because I know a lot about work, and all the questions related to theology, and Francis will take that. No, I'm joking. Maybe let me start with Obi's question, because it was particularly about the sermon. So I do see, so there was a part of my notes that I skipped because I was checking the clock. So maybe that could have provided a little bit more clarity. But my point wasn't that you should just stay in difficult situations endlessly. My point, though, was that shouldn't be the knee-jerk reaction. I think as human beings, particularly because comfort is such a big idol for us in the 21st century, and I mean, even for those of us who are living in Lagos, in Lekki, like if you're in this room right now, chances are you're actually better than most of people out there. That's the truth. Even though things may not be all that you want them to be, but chances are you're actually doing a lot better than people out there. So we have to be careful about a certain mindset that always wants to avoid difficulty. I think I quoted that passage, Romans 5. I have seen in my own life, I have one, not many. I've seen in my own life that the growth that I've experienced has been as a result of staying in places that are less than ideal. So I don't think our knee-jerk reaction should be to sort of leave difficult workplaces. I do think that even though you may end up leaving, there should be a gradation of steps. So for instance, can you sort of talk to your employer or your line manager, whoever it is, and say, hey, we really need these tools. And I think part of the ways that we can do that is not just to set the expectation of what we need, but also paint a picture of what will happen as a result. I think what happens with many employers is that they actually don't see the benefit that is going to add to their organization. Oftentimes they think that you just want something cool or something nice. But I think that most people who have a good heart or a good mindset want to actually see the organization grow. And if you paint a picture of, if we do X, Y, and Z, this is actually what is going to happen as a result for us. So I think that's the first step. A second step can be sort of talking with somebody who is between you and that person. So if there's an intermediary between you and that person, maybe somebody who is, maybe another colleague or somebody else who is aware of the situation, you can approach that person. If it seems then that you have done all that you can do and it seems like it's not changing, then you may actually have to leave the organization because, again, like I was sharing earlier, part of a duty of the employer or a line manager, a boss, is actually to make sure that the person under them becomes the best version of themselves possible. And so if that is not happening, because the person is not actually taking heed to advice, or the person is incorrigible, or the person's priorities seem lost, then it may be wise to leave. But I will caution heavily against sort of leaving. I know people who, sometimes I've heard cases of people who just leave. And like, okay, what are you leaving to? The person doesn't really have something else. They just want to leave. And then, this person then comes back several months later, and then the person's asking people for help. They're like, but we told you not to leave. So I do think that we have to be careful that escaping pressure, escaping difficulty is not a knee-jerk reaction, but we actually try as much as best as possible to flourish in the circumstances that we find ourselves.
So is Toki still around? Let me see if I can answer Toki's question about boarding school. He's not here.
No, he's not.
Okay. So because Toki is not here, I'll give him some time to come back. Dorcas, your question about being born again, and I would like you to chip into this as well. But being born again, and let's say you find out that Christianity is no longer for you. There's a lot packed into that question a little bit, because it will first of all require me to get a sense of what you think Christianity is about, right? And why you came to the point where you now say, oh, Christianity is no longer for you, right? So if we look at that aspect of what really does it mean when you say that you are now a Christian, it means that you have now believed in Jesus Christ, right? Or more importantly, you have believed in the gospel of Jesus Christ. That is, Jesus Christ, God has set out a plan for saving people through his son, Jesus Christ. That by sending his son, Jesus Christ, to the world to die for us, he rose again, right? He is resurrected, and that he will come again. And that by believing in that, my sins are forgiven. And that was how one became a Christian. Then, what you are probably referring to when you say Christianity is not for you is there's a certain lifestyle that is expected of you. And that in that sort of circumstance, you are going into what exactly is the thing that would make you say that Christianity is no longer for you, right? But if you are talking about, say, for instance, what is commonly referred to as backsliding, right? That is, you set off on this Christian journey and you started to do the things that you believe that God wanted you to do, but at some point, you find yourself falling back into sin. And your question is, if you find yourself falling back into sin, does that mean that you are no longer going to, and I will not say heaven per se, I will say, does that mean you are no longer going to be in God's favor? And by God's favor, I mean eventually dwell with God forever, which is what I believe you are referring to as heaven, dwelling with God forever. The answer is no, because that is not so much the reason why you became a Christian. The reason how you became a Christian was because you put your faith in Jesus Christ. That is what gets you access into God's favor. And by falling into sin, what God gives us the privilege or the opportunity to do is to always come back to him. And that is what a Christian community is supposed to do for you. So if what you're asking on the one hand is, if the lifestyle of Christianity is not something that I really like, and I'm not really seeing how it's going to favor me, the question would be, that thing that you are talking about, is that what Christianity is? Because Christianity really is about putting your faith in Jesus Christ, right? But if what you're asking is, if I backslide, can I actually still find myself having favor with God? The answer is yes, because God gives us that access to always come back to him, because that is what believing in Jesus Christ gives us the right to do. There is one more aspect, right? There is the aspect of, I've believed in Jesus Christ, or I've put my faith in Jesus Christ, and then I have a 180-degree turnaround. I now come to believe that this Christianity is actually wrong, it's not right. And that is having a complete, in biblical terms, it's called apostasy, right? In that case, one would say that perhaps you never really put your faith in Jesus Christ in the first place, right? And always the goal will be to see how to bring people to put their faith in Jesus Christ. I don't know, I tried 3 different things because I wasn't sure where exactly your mind was with your question. I'm suspecting it's somewhere in the second one where somebody finds themselves backsliding and they want to actually, think about how their lives are now with regards to the gospel. Does that help in any way, Dorcas?
Maybe I can add this, and we can sort of chat after.
Yes.
I've been reading the book of Revelation, and particularly now I'm in the letters of Jesus to the churches, which is really at the beginning. So that tells you how fast I am. But one of the things I found really both challenging and encouraging is that while Jesus is rebuking those churches, except 2 churches, the rest, like, he has really hard words for them. One of them, he says that you have allowed somebody, Jezebel, in your midst, right? And this Jezebel is basically leading and directing the church. I think that's the church in Thyatira. So he has really hard words for them. But Jesus also has encouraging words for them. On the one hand, Jesus is able to rebuke. On the one hand, he's also able to invite. And I think that wherever on the spectrum of the 3 things that Francis has, shown that maybe you are, or maybe asking about somebody else, wherever that person is, today you can still come. Jesus' arms are open. Like, if you've walked with Christ for 50 years and you've turned back, as long as there is breath, as long as there is a second, as long as life hasn't ended, Jesus' arms are still open. And that's really what I want you to take away. Like, Jesus is not shocked at our brokenness or our messed upness. Jesus is not shocked by how much you actually betray him. Peter betrayed Jesus. Like, he literally walked with Jesus in the flesh for 3.5 years, and he turns back and says, I don't know that guy. And yet somehow Jesus, in the magnitude of his heart, is still able to say, I want you to lead my church. That's the heart of Christ that we have. And so I want to leave you with that, and hopefully that encourages you, and you can speak with either me or Francis again, at the end, if you want to share a little bit more. Grace's question. So Grace's question is, how do you find yourself that people who sort of don't have, people who can't do stuff as well as you can, they get more accolades than you who can actually do the thing well. How do you strike that balance between tooting your own horn and actually also, on one hand, maybe showing some restraint, but also saying, I'm able to do this thing? And I think that's a very good question, because I found myself in that sort of circumstance. So there's a sense in which my work is here. I by God's grace, I have the privilege of working with City Church full time. And so my work is here. There's a certain kind of visibility to my work. But there's also a certain kind of hiddenness to my work. I have meetings with people, late nights. Sometimes people don't know, all kinds of things. And so there's a certain kind of hiddenness that if you're not sort of in the loop, you really don't know what's going on. And so we have this appraisal, metric in the office. We have half-year appraisals, and then at the end of the appraisals. And on one of the appraisals, my boss, Pastor Femi, was saying something. I was like, yeah, wise, but like this thing that you're saying, I disagree because I'm doing them. And she was like, but I don't know. I was like, but my work is unto the Lord. That's what I told her. I said, my work is unto the Lord. He said, but it's not the Lord that will appraise you now. It's me that will appraise you. And so, like, he helped me to actually say, yes, so my work is unto the Lord, but there is a way in which I actually have to be, as it were, making returns or making reports of the things that have been entrusted into my hands. Even some things that haven't been entrusted into my hands, but I get the privilege of leading and serving in. And I think it's the same thing, right? That even when we are in our workspaces, we always have to be the kind of people who are comfortable enough to say, either I can do this thing, or these are the things I've done, and I think that I need to be given a favorable rating on this. The difference between somebody who is doing that as eye service, somebody who is doing that boastfully, and somebody who is doing that from a place of humility is the motivation of the heart. So like I was sharing with Ruth, Ruth's motivation wasn't, she wanted favor from somebody, so somebody had to see her. But her motivation wasn't so that she could be seen by people, if you get my point. Her motivation came from something deeper. And I think particularly those of us with less loud personalities, or those of us who are shy, or people who are sort of reserved, we struggle in this way because it is not natural for us to sort of toot our own horn. Like, the way I was raised was, let somebody else praise you. And so now you are thrust into a workplace where, in many ways, actually, you have to praise yourself. And so if you do find yourself in that sort of situation, I think you have to just say, what is the motivation of my heart? It is good for my employer to actually know the things that I can do, because the things that I can do help my organization to reach its goals, but they also help me to become the better version of myself that God has intended. And so you just always check the motivation of your heart. Sometimes you may even be doing certain things and you feel like it's not necessary for this to be known. But generally, let it be that the motivation of your heart comes from a place of rest, security in Christ. And so that whether you have to speak about yourself or not, you can do that freely. But don't feel that you necessarily, have to either hide or go on this other showy extreme so that you can be seen by people. I don't know if
No. I think that's spot on. I think I will now try and answer. I can see Toki now, so I'm going to try and answer Toki's question on the boarding on boarding school. So I think the sermon that you're referring to a few weeks ago, PF was talking more about a married couple and the closeness that needs to happen to a married couple, especially if they are Christians. And I think what he was leveraging on is what you find in Genesis, where it says that a man shall leave his mother and father and cleave to his wife, and all of what is packed in that statement, cleaving to his wife, right? It means, in very many ways, I'm not going to go into much detail, but it means that cleaving includes the fact that couple ought to share the same physical space. And I suppose the admonition there, or the exhortation that PF was giving, is that as far as is within your control, every married couple should be striving to stay together, right? Now, there are occasional circumstances that warrant that a couple will be apart for a time, but it should always be at the back of their minds that they should be trying to get back together. Unfortunately, or fortunately, there isn't a similar instruction for parents and children, for any sort of cleaving to happen between parents and children. So I'm not of the opinion that there's anything wrong with sending a kid to a boarding school. I think it's perfectly okay when you consider all of the things that boarding school, all of the advantages that boarding school presents to children. And even more so, if I understand the way boarding schools are, for a period of time, the kid will be away, only to come back. Every time kids go off to boarding school, when the term is about to be over, they will say, I'm going back home, right? So there's the idea that this thing I'm doing here is temporary, but going back home there's a place that is actually home. But nonetheless, I don't think there's any, I think that thing about a couple being apart and striving to be together is specifically for a married couple and not so much the children. I don't know if that helps. Okay.
If I can just chip in. So I do think everything Francis said, true. There is no prohibition. And so just like Francis was saying and Pastor Femi was saying, when there is no explicit prohibition, we have to then ensure that the reason why we're doing what we're doing is motivated from a right place. And so, maybe somebody's working a difficult job and there is no opportunity, like in my wife's former workplace, there was somebody there who was a single mom. She was living on the mainland. She was working on the island. And it wasn't even just like it was a very far place on the mainland. There was no way for her to maintain security for the child in the area where they're living in. There was no way to monitor the development of the child. There were just a number of things that she couldn't do. And so the ideal option wasn't available at that point. And so she then had to send the child to boarding school. There are also people, even married couples, people who maybe they live in the same geographical space, but their work doesn't sort of allow them to be able to provide that to the child. And so I think that in those sort of circumstances, I think that very perfect and legitimate reasons, I would just charge those parents to be involved as much as possible in the life of that child, calling, texting, all those kinds of things. But I think there are also bad reasons why people send their kids to boarding school. I think this one was my wife that helped me to really see it. When a parent says things like, I'm sending them to boarding school so that it can be disciplined. I don't know. As in, I think that the role of the parent is to discipline that child. If that child is not disciplined, and you think that it is by sending them to boarding school that they will be disciplined, I think that parent may be shirking their responsibility to raise up a child in the way of the Lord. It is not boarding school that is just like when you send your kids to city kids, you are not hoping that city kids will raise them up for you. Or at least maybe that's what you're hoping. That's not what city kid does. What city kid does is meant to come alongside the parent to help raise that child. And so boarding school is not intended for that purpose. And so I think that oftentimes parents, sort of have those not always great reasons why they send kids to school. And so they have to be aware of that when we're sending them to boarding school, it has to come from a right and godly place as well. I think Nengi's question is the last question. The last two questions. So I'm going to attempt, and then maybe Francis can have the last word. So the first question was on shame, and using shame as a sort of method of, bringing somebody back to faith. I would say, yeah, for smaller sins, yes. Like, is it extreme? Sort of, maybe not even, but is it appropriate? Yes. Is it appropriate for like smaller sins? I would say actually, it's to us that those sins, first of all, it's to us that those sins actually seem small. It's shocking how the Bible doesn't have chills for people who are disorderly, people who are liars, people who are ungrateful. In 2 Timothy chapter 3, one of the signs of the end times that Paul lists is unthankfulness. And so, there is as much in common with somebody who is a chronically unthankful, ungrateful person as somebody who doesn't know Christ. Because there is no way, in Paul's mind, it is that there is no link between having met Christ, having received this free offer of grace, and a proud, entitled heart. There is no link between them. So that's the first thing, that some of those things they are not small in that sense. But I think on the whole that the sort of idea when Paul is talking about breaking off contact with them so that they can be ashamed, is not so much, I think, is in the end goal that you're trying to produce. I think that's what Paul is pointing out there. So your end goal is not that this person should be ashamed. Your end goal is that this person can be corrected and restored. In the process, they might be ashamed. But ultimately, what you are trying to do is not for them to be shamed endlessly. It is for them to be restored. And when he's talking about shame there, he's saying that the person the person realizes, it's more or less repentance. The person realizes the wrong that they have done, and then they turn back. I think sometimes there's been a tendency, particularly like you were saying, those of us who grew up in conservative church cultures, to latch on to shame as the thing that actually causes change. And that's not it. That's not the parallel. Like, shame is not what causes change. Change comes from a gracious, like, you have done this, so we have to separate from you. As instead of, we're going to now platform you and announce to the whole church that you have done this thing so that you can be ashamed and then you change. That's not Paul's point. So I think that Paul's point is there has to be sort of a gracious way of breaking off contact with the person. And when he's saying breaking off contact with the person, he's not saying that you never talk to the person again. He's saying that in the context of the gathering of the church, we don't recognize you as a believer. And there are many people who come to this church who are not Christians, like people sometimes who live active, sinful lifestyles. We're not going to say, come outside and announce to everybody. No, but we do want you to know that what you are doing is wrong, but at the same time, we extend the love and grace of Christ to you. And so I think that's sort of what Paul has in mind in that sort of passage. Your second question was about Peter and suffering. And should we, thank you. So should we fight against injustice? I think the context in which Peter is writing and ours is similar but different in some ways. So Peter is writing at a time where Christians were the minority in the culture. Christians were maligned in the culture. They basically almost had no rights. Christians were hated by the larger society, the Roman culture, but also detested by Jews as well. And so in many ways, they didn't have an effective system of justice that was made available to them. And what Peter is saying ultimately is that God, even where it seems like things are not working out for you guys, God can still be at work and use your suffering as a means to actually draw these people to yourself. And he uses the example of Jesus Christ, chapter 2, verse 20, to this were you called, that should follow in his steps. So he uses Jesus Christ's sacrifice as a sort of model for what God can actually accomplish through your suffering in that sort of circumstance. I think that's very different from being in a situation where you can fight against injustice and not do anything about it. In fact, I think it's Paul who is talking about somebody who is in a condition of slavery, and then he says that he's writing to slaves, and he says, if you can find your freedom, I encourage you to do so. And so the Bible recognizes that actually our God is a just God, and there may be times where things are not going well for us. If we're in positions where we can seek justice against the wrong that we have experienced, go all out for it. But if we're in positions where, like many Christians sometimes in the north of Nigeria or in other places in the Middle East, Qatar, like I was watching a documentary yesterday, where you can't sort of fight against some of the injustices being done to you, Peter is saying, find strength in what God can accomplish through your suffering. I think a sort of difficult category might be cases where somebody has experienced injustice and there is availability of seeking redress for the person. And sometimes people still say, now leave it all for God. I think that shouldn't be our typical response. Our typical response should be, if we are able to fight against injustice, let's go out for it. Particularly where it concerns other people, and particularly where it's something that is systemic. Yeah.
I was just going to say that aspect of where it concerns other people. But I also think that with regards to fighting injustice, that there is a caution about the how we fight the injustice, right? And I think for most of what we face, right, that is perhaps more of an issue. How are you actually fighting against injustice? When Jesus was being arrested and Peter took out his sword and, tried to cut off the soldier's ear, Jesus Christ rebuked him. He was trying to fight what he felt was injustice, but he was doing it in a way that was going against what Jesus Christ knew, what Jesus Christ wanted him to do, right? That didn't stop Jesus Christ from, in front of Caesar, for instance, defending himself when he was asked questions, right? He answered the questions in a way that said, I am not guilty of the thing that you are saying that I am guilty of. So that's another thing I'll caution. The other thing I wanted to add to the question about what was it? Shame, and I had something I wrote down here. Yeah. So the goal for Christians will never be to shame someone. In fact, if you look at the passage in Thessalonians that you read, as Emmanuel rightly pointed out, what Paul tells them to do is to not relate with the person that is idle. He doesn't then the result of not relating with the person is that the person will feel ashamed. He doesn't say shame them. Do you get what I mean? In Matthew as well, where it gives us, if you have a problem with someone, you talk to him about it, take one or two brothers and try to talk to him about it. Tell it to the church. If he still doesn't respond, treat him as you would a tax collector. That's what he says. He doesn't say, oh, shame him. It means treat him as though he's not really a member of this thing. And then by that treatment, by the fact that you're actually not regarding him as a fellow Christian, the desired effect of that is that he would do a bit of a self-reflection and then feel ashamed of his position. And perhaps, again, to Emmanuel's point, that would then lead him to turn around. Jesus, treating someone like a tax collector does not mean you never relate with the person, to Emmanuel's point, because we know that one of the kinds of people that Jesus Christ related with most are tax collectors. So if Jesus is saying treat him as though he were a tax collector, do you get what I mean? So the goal is never to say, oh, what can I do to make this guy feel really ashamed? What is the thing that, okay, I know what we'll do. Let's bring him up here. Let's tell everybody what he has done. Let him bow his head down in shame. That is never the goal. In fact, more often than not, that will probably make the guy keep away more. So I just wanted to point out that slight difference about the feeling ashamed is more of an effect and not the act that is being done for somebody that you're trying to reconcile. That's it.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a blessed week.